They expected your silence to be the final act, that after everything they did, the gaslighting, the quiet erosion, the dismembering of your name in rooms you never entered, you'd collapse with a sob and a resignation letter. They anticipated the crumpled version of you, the one too broken to stand, too tired to question, too lost to retaliate. That's the story they had rehearsed. The fragile one, the apologetic one, press a few buttons. The version of you that would sit in the ruins and wait for permission to matter again. But you didn't read their script. You tore it up and rewrote the narrative with one blood-dipped quill. I survived. Now I decide. You didn't scream. You didn't beg. You simply got up, eyes feral with clarity, and walked into the storm with no umbrella and a grin. And that shattered them. See, people who weaponize guilt don't know what to do when the intended target doesn't bleed. They threw knives, press a few buttons, and you caught them with your chest, then handed them back without flinching. That unnerves them, because the entire system they built relied on your obedience to the role they gave you. The broken one, the dependent one, the one who would need their validation just to breathe properly. But instead of pleading, you smiled. You stitched your own wounds. You turned every insult into an incantation, and that quiet power, that refusal to be pitied, is what makes their hands tremble now. Press few buttons. They don't fear your anger. They fear your composure. They fear that you might actually be better without them, that you might thrive, that you might outshine the image they smeared in whispers. They built a false empire on your suffering, and you're burning it down with poise. Understand what that does to someone who saw themselves as your puppeteer. They expected to pull strings and watch you dance. Instead, you lit the stage and made them perform their cowardice in front of their own illusions. You became a mirror, and they couldn't handle the reflection. You didn't retaliate the way they hoped. No loud explosions, no reactive vengeance. Just a slow, terrifying evolution. Every time you didn't react, they unraveled. Every time you smiled instead of breaking, you reminded them of the control they never truly had. And now they're suffocating. Not because you left, but because you didn't collapse first. Power, to them, was always in how much they could keep you wounded. They never prepared for the day you stopped bleeding. Psychologically, there's something unsettling about a target who doesn't respond. They were banking on your trauma doing the talking. Trauma is predictable. Trauma obeys patterns. It folds inwards. It stays low. It avoids confrontation. But you didn't do that. You evolved past it. You became the anomaly their manipulative framework couldn't account for. They pressed buttons that used to make you beg, and nothing happened. No reaction, no guilt, regression. Just silence, then progress. And that void where your compliance used to be, it's deafening to them. A few buttons. They panic because they don't understand how you went from begging for clarity to becoming the storm, how you morphed pain into presence. They thought they knew your programming, but they forgot that pain either breaks you or builds something beyond their comprehension. You didn't play the victim. You became the architect. And that's terrifying to people who were only ever powerful when you were on your knees. Now, they have to face a version of you that holds the blueprint. The version that understands psychological warfare. Because a few buttons, because you've lived in the trenches and clawed your way out. You speak calmly now. You smile politely, but beneath that is a mind sharpened by betrayal. They can feel it, that you're no longer moved by shallow apologies or fragile excuses. You've transcended the narrative, and people panic when they realize they can't manipulate what they can't define. You became unpredictable, not emotionally unstable, intellectually dangerous. You ask better questions now. You observe longer. You speak less, but when you do, it's surgical. Press a few buttons. That's what shakes them. They don't panic because you're distant. They panic because you're free. Press few buttons. They can't control what no longer craves their validation. Your refusal to play the victim stripped them of their weaponry. And now they're left with echoes. You didn't return fire. You have transmuted it. Became fire. Your growth mocked their intentions. They tried to wound you, and instead, created someone they now have to answer to. Not with fear, but with shame. That's the game changer. You're not seeking revenge. You're building an empire in the ruins they thought would bury you. They wanted your weakness framed as your identity. But you took their entire narrative and reread it in ink so dark, it made your silence feel like thunder. It hurts them more that you're calm, press a few buttons, that you don't need to explain, that you've outgrown the very battlefield to try to trap you in. Press a few buttons. Your refusal to play the victim made them the villain. And now they're scrambling to rewrite history before others start noticing the truth. Friends, they're panicking, not because of what you did, but because of what you refused to do. You didn't cry publicly. You didn't sabotage yourself to get their attention. You healed in silence. You smiled with wisdom. And you made peace with things that were meant to destroy you. That kind of resilience is unbearable to people who feed off suffering. You made pain look regal. You turned grief into strategy. And now, they're the ones stuck in the past, trying to rationalize a world where you no longer orbit their gravity. You became the worst-case scenario they never prepared for, a survivor with receipts, a soul that remembers everything but carries none of it with weight. You became what they feared, someone who doesn't need to be pitied, saved, or understood. And that independence is the death of their influence. They told a version of your story that cast you as a helpless character, one who needed them. Now they see you as the author, scribbling out their role altogether. You never screamed. You never cursed them. You simply outlived the part they wrote for you. And there is no greater punishment to a narcissist than the absence of narrative control. You left their pages, and now you write in volumes. This isn't just survival. It's alchemy. You turned manipulation into mastery. Every abandonment became an upgrade. Every rejection sharpened your voice. You no longer chase explanations. You hand people the mirror and let them suffer their own reflection. That's power. That's evolution. That's the mark of someone who realized the real game was never about being loved. It was about being seen. And once you saw yourself clearly, you no longer needed them to confirm your worth. You no longer needed to bleed to prove you were alive. You woke up, cleaned your wounds, and dressed like royalty. And they have to watch, knowing they tried to bury the very crown you now wear. They thought they choreographed your collapse to perfection. The tension, the betrayal, the isolating silences, all carefully arranged, like a psychological stage play with you cast as the helpless lead. You weren't supposed to rise. That wasn't in the script. They rehearsed your breakdown in their minds the late night texts begging for answers, the trembling voice cracking in public, the stammered apologies that would give them the power of choice again. You were supposed to beg for closure, for clarity, for anything that resembled dignity. That's the role they wanted you to embody. And when you didn't, when you rose from the ashes without asking for permission, you didn't just ruin their plan. You dismantled the entire theater they built to house your pain. They tried to write your ending before you finished the first act. In their fantasy, you'd vanish quietly, discarded, forgotten, replaced. You would break apart in a way that left no evidence behind. That was the ideal, a silent disappearance that confirmed your weakness and exalted their righteousness. But you rose, not by shouting, not by retaliating, by simply continuing, by breathing where they hoped you'd suffocate, by healing in ways they cannot mimic. And that kind of resilience terrifies those who rely on your dependence for their own narrative to make sense. You broke their fourth wall, the one where they whispered to others that you were too fragile, too lost, too unstable. Now, they stare in horror as you become the proof that they were the villain, not the visionary. People who orchestrate your downfall don't just fear your strength, they fear your survival, because surviving implies they failed. And failure is not part of their ego's vocabulary. They would rather paint themselves as the victim of your reaction than admit they provoked it. They wanted you to unravel, to come undone so publicly that it rewrote every good thing you ever were. They wanted their cruelty to become your defining trait. But resilience doesn't scream. It evolves. It reemerges stronger, sharper, more elegant than the weapon they used to try to end you. That's what breaks them now. Not the fact that you walked away, but that you did so without limping, without needing them to see, without performing your pain for their satisfaction. They built a trap made of memory and manipulation, counting on your loyalty to hold you hostage. But you turned the trap into a template for escape, for reinvention. They underestimated the silent architecture of your mind, thought that their betrayal would echo so loudly, it would drown your inner voice. But it only amplified it. And now you speak in a language they can't comprehend, one of self-respect, one of ruthless clarity, one where you don't explain yourself because power never explains. It simply exists. You weren't supposed to be here, not like this, not intact, not unbothered. That was never part of their fantasy. And now, they're forced to improvise in a story that no longer centers them. They cast you as fragile because they feared your depth. People always try to break what they can't control. Your sensitivity was never weakness. It was threat. It meant you saw more, felt more, remembered more. And that made you dangerous to people who prefer fog over mirrors. They tried to crush your spirit under the weight of your empathy, expected your compassion to turn on itself. But you turned it into steel. You refused to become what hurt you. That's why you won. You rose without vengeance, without malice. You simply evolved past their reach. And that kind of ascension feels like betrayal to those who believed your survival depended on their approval. You weren't supposed to rise, because your rise exposes the blueprint. It shows the pattern. It invites others to question, to walk away, to grow past the same manipulation. That's why they panic now. Not because you escaped, but because others might follow. You became the proof that healing without them is not only possible, it's inevitable. They feel the ground shifting, the roles reversing. You, the once muted, now speaking fluently in your own worth. And them, they can no longer weaponize your past when you wear it like armor. Every time you speak with strength, they lose control of the narrative they crafted so carefully behind your back. They don't hate that you recovered. They hate that you look powerful doing it. That your glow up wasn't shallow or cosmetic. It was cellular. You healed your core. You looked at your pain and chose transformation over revenge. You became the kind of force that needs no introduction, no explanation. You walk into rooms now and they grow smaller, because you're no longer willing to shrink. You left their script on the floor, torn and unreadable, and wrote a new one with your blood and backbone. That's what they can't forgive, that they couldn't break you. And worse, that you don't need to break them back to prove it. They once spoke over you. Now, they speak about you. Whisper your name like a warning. They try to downplay what you've become, hoping others won't notice. But you don't need their acknowledgement anymore. You don't even need their fear. Your silence is now heavy with consequence. You've mastered the art of unbothered revenge, becoming so complete, so untouchable, that their presence feels like a footnote in your story. You weren't supposed to have the last word, but you became the entire language. And now, all they have are stories of the day they tried to end you and failed spectacularly. You were supposed to disappear. That was the plan. They bet everything on your surrender. But instead you expanded. You outgrew the space they kept you in. You made discomfort your cocoon and pain your oxygen. You rose, not despite the suffering, but because of it. You used it. You refined it. And now, they don't recognize the shape of you. You were the caterpillar they tried to kill mid-transformation. Now, you're the storm their illusions can't survive. They always counted on your collapse to be their cloak. That was the plan from the start. A public unraveling. A scene so dramatic, so wounded, that it distracted everyone from the subtleties of their cruelty. The more you broke, press a few buttons, the more they looked like the hero who tried to help. Your suffering was supposed to be their cover story. But when you didn't play the victim, when you didn't scream, beg, or fall apart for the crowd, their entire disguise began to disintegrate. Because if you don't react the way they rehearsed in private, They lose control of the public narrative. And with that silence, with that poise, with that terrifying calm, something else happened. People started to look deeper, to rewatch the footage in their heads. And slowly, their villainy began to glow in the dark. It's a strange phenomenon, really. How restraint becomes revelation. You didn't lash out. You didn't parade your wounds. You simply stopped entertaining their script. You walked off stage, and in doing so, made the whole performance look ridiculous. And in that stillness, that refusal to participate, people began to notice the cracks. The sarcasm that wasn't funny. The jokes that aged badly. The way they always seemed to center themselves in stories that had nothing to do with them. Suddenly, their charm became noise. Their excuses felt hollow. Their aura, that carefully curated air of misunderstood innocence, began to rot. Because it only worked when you played your part. Without your public pain, there was no tragedy to save you from. Without your breakdown, there was no contrast to make them seem balanced. You took their spotlight by turning it back on them. People don't realize how much darkness is disguised as charisma until the person meant to absorb the blame steps out of frame. Your absence from the pity script made space for clarity. It invited others to think for themselves, to question timelines, to recall tones, to ask, why did I never notice that before? You see, your dignity became a mirror, not just for them, but for everyone watching. And the reflection wasn't flattering. Because when the accused refuses to defend themselves, the accuser suddenly looks louder, more desperate, less composed. You chose elegance over eruption, and that forced the room to wonder, what kind of monster requires their victim to scream before we believe them? Your silence carried weight. It wasn't weakness. It was indictment. People began tracing your path, revisiting the dynamics they dismissed before. The subtle power imbalances, the veiled mockery, the strange need to always be one step above you. And in your refusal to collapse, they found clues. In your refusal to retaliate, they found patterns. You became undeniable. Not because you exposed them with vengeance, but because you didn't need to. And that's what made it undeniable. No theatrics, no smear campaign. Just the airy calm of someone who knows what happened and doesn't need the world's sympathy to validate it. That scares people, because it forces them to confront the reality that harm doesn't always come with fangs and screams. Sometimes, it comes with applause and a polished smile. They needed you reactive. They needed you emotional. Because then, they could reframe it. Anger could be labeled instability. Sadness could be dismissed as manipulation. But when you didn't respond, when you simply rose, dressed in clarity, and moved forward, that shattered the illusion they had spent years crafting. Their only defense was your destruction, and you didn't give it to them. You took their favorite weapon, your pain, and refused to let them wield it. And in doing so, press a few buttons, they were left holding nothing but the echoes of their own lies. Their villainy was never hidden. It just needed the absence of noise to be heard. What's wild is how quickly the air shifts once people start seeing it. Once the mask slips, even for a moment, people can't unsee it. And when you chose composure over chaos, you gave the world a front row seat to their unraveling. Not because you said anything, but because you said nothing. They began to panic, trying to reclaim control, oversharing, over-explaining, pushing narratives that didn't stick. But the more they talked, the more transparent they became, because now there was no distraction, no emotional outburst to pin their version onto, just your progress, your peace, your power. And against that backdrop, their manipulation looked obvious. Their gaslighting felt tired, and their presence in your story became less like a protagonist and more like a parasite. You weren't supposed to survive with this much grace. You were supposed to make their job easier by being the wreck they warned others about. But instead, you became proof. Proof that pain can evolve. That trauma doesn't always chain you to the floor. That some people get up and rewrite the ending in real time. And that infuriates the people who counted on your silence being soaked in shame. You didn't wear guilt. You wore growth. And the difference between the two is what made the truth visible to everyone else. People aren't stupid. They just need a reason to look deeper. And when you stepped back from the drama, when you stopped feeding their performance, you gave them that reason. Let this sink in. They lost the plot when you refused to play the role. They weren't prepared for an opponent who heals in public, but never performs it, who rebuilds without needing credit, who rises without declaring war. That's the true villain arc, isn't it? Rising without permission, thriving without justification. Your evolution is the very thing they tried to prevent. And now, their worst nightmare has come true. People see them, not just the curated version, the real one, the one behind the crocodile tears, the one who needed you broken to feel whole, the one who now has to face the fact that they created the very storm they're drowning in. You owe them nothing, not silence, not revenge, not validation. The truth already did the heavy lifting for you. Your restraint was your rebellion. Your clarity was your comeback. And now they exist in the aftermath of a failed manipulation. Exposed, cornered, decaying. You don't need to tell your side. You became it. They weren't looking for healing. They were hunting for justification. They needed your breakdown like oxygen. Not because they cared, but because your collapse would serve as the ultimate permission slip for everything they did to you. If you snapped, if you raged, if you lost control, then suddenly their cruelty would make sense to others. They needed the fall to fit the crime. You were the living proof they were hoping to corrupt, not with fists, not with rage, with patience, with subtle sabotage, with years of planted seeds and psychological erosion. Buttons. If they could make you react destructively, then they could twist the entire narrative into, see, this is what I was dealing with. That's the goal of manipulation. Not just control over your mind, but over your legacy. They wanted to provoke something ugly, a meltdown, a scream, a public rupture. That was their weapon of choice, your own reaction. Because if you cracked open in front of others, they could lean back, fold their arms, and say, "Told you." That's what they were preparing for all along. Not to hurt you in a way that was obvious, but to injure you slowly, strategically. Then step back and document your explosion like a scientist studying proof of their own hypothesis. They crafted chaos in your world, then pretended to be the observer, the calm one, the voice of reason. And when you didn't combust, when you stood there, blood in your mouth but spine intact, they lost their narrative. They lost their evidence. They lost control. That's the part they'll never admit. That your self-control ruined their story. They were preparing to play the victim of your trauma, not the perpetrator of it. They couldn't wait to weaponize your broken pieces against you, to quote your worst moments like scripture, to build a case not with facts, but with emotions, yours. But when you didn't perform, when you chose silence over spectacle, when you kept your dignity while they threw mud, that was a death sentence for the version of the story they had been rehearsing for months, maybe years. They weren't cruel because they lacked empathy. They were cruel because they were counting on your breakdown to cleanse their conscience. They knew exactly what they were doing. You weren't just someone they hurt. You were a project, something to erode slowly. They chipped at your identity piece by piece, because if they did it all at once, others might notice. But if you slowly lost your light, they could blame it on your mental state. They needed your disintegration to look internal, self-inflicted. She's always been like that. He's just unstable. That's the lie they were engineering. Your sanity was never their concern, only your collapse, because a person who breaks becomes a myth, a cautionary tale, easier to erase, easier to blame. You were never meant to survive with grace. They didn't plan for that kind of resilience. The irony, they couldn't even handle your silence. You would think someone so committed to breaking you would be satisfied once you went quiet, once you stopped giving them access to your emotions. But no, the absence of chaos made them louder, more desperate. They started inventing problems you didn't react to. painting stories you weren't in, projecting wounds that belonged to them. Because without your breakdown, they had nothing. And that's the danger of composure. To the manipulative, it's terrifying. It reflects all their efforts wasted, all their months, their mind games, their whispered smears. Undone by a single decisioning, your refusal to fall apart on cue. You could have played the victim. You had every right. You had the receipts, the scars, the sleepless nights. You could have burned every bridge and still been justified. But you chose something else. You chose discipline. And that cost them everything.